Hello, EE Scholars! Welcome to lesson number 3 of the Ecology and Evolution series. Today we'll be going over Charles Darwin, just some basic details this time, natural selection, reproductive success, adaptations, countershading, and adventitious adaptations. I know that it sounds like we've got a lot to do today, but I promise that it won't actually be that bad. Okay, let's get into it. Now, I'd suspect, or hope, that all of you have heard of Charles Robert Darwin at some point in your lives. I'd also suspect that you know what he's famous for, namely the theory of evolution. But before we talk about the theory itself, I want to quickly disclaim that calling evolution a theory doesn't diminish it. Despite the way we use the word theory in everyday language, it has a very different meaning in science. You see, first a science will develop a hypothesis, or an educated guess on what will happen when they perform an experiment. Then, if that hypothesis turns out to be true and gets tested over and over for centuries, still proving to be true, that hypothesis can be upgraded into a theory. If a theory is pretty much proven, we hesitate to say that anything's actually proven in science since we can't prove that something will or won't happen in the future. Then it becomes a law. So calling it the theory of evolution is actually a fairly high honor in the science world. Now, what do we mean by evolution? Well, evolution is defined as change in the genetic frequency in a population over time. That just means that certain traits, coloration, height, shape, will become more or less common in a species over time. This is usually due to environmental changes. I'm going to show you a few examples in the next slide, but before that, let's talk a little bit about Charles Darwin himself. Charles Robert Darwin was born in 1809 and died in 1882. In 1859, he wrote a book about his theory of evolution that was called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Notice how favored is spelled a little differently than we would normally spell it. That's because Darwin was British, and they spell it differently than Americans do. So if you have to spell out the name of Darwin's book, remember to use the British version of favored. These are just a few examples of evolution. On the left, notice the different beak shapes of every finch. Throughout multiple generations, each bird's ancestors have faced different environmental pressures, largely different seeds that were available to them, and that caused them to evolve differently. On the right, we have another classic example of evolution. You can clearly see the different traits or characteristics that are displayed in each step of the drawing. Over time, going from left to right, the genetic frequency of bodily hair decreases, which is just one example of evolution within this picture. Next, we move on to natural selection. This is one of the 5 mechanisms of evolution. We'll discuss the other ones in a later video. For now, know that natural selection is the only one of the 5 that will never result in something bad. That's because natural selection functions on the selection of good traits to carry into the next generation, whereas the other mechanisms are a bit more blind. There are 4 components of natural selection. There must be variation in traits among individuals in the population, that variation must be heritable, there must be competition, and there must be differential reproductive success. Let's break this down starting with the first one. Natural selection brings more favorable traits into the next population. But how can this happen if there are no less favorable traits? So there must be a variation in the traits among individuals in a population. For the next one, suppose that you have a species in which 2 males are competing for a female. Both males look exactly the same and have the same general qualities, but then one of those males, by one way or another, manages to dye itself blue. This blue color somehow helps it to survive its environment and makes it more attractive to the female. This, however, would not be an example of natural selection because natural selection is concerned with the passing on of favorable traits so that the species may survive. Here, there's nothing to pass on, and the next generation will receive no benefit. Now, onto competition. This explains why it is so important for favorable traits to get passed on. In a perfect world, everything would be able to get food, water, and shelter, and everything else that it needs. In that world, there would be no reason to select mates based on certain traits other than surface-level attraction. But that's not the world that we live in. Rather, selecting a mate that is able to collect enough resources for itself and survive against predators through the use of its favorable traits could be the difference between life and death for the offspring. As such, competition gives the things in nature a reason for natural selection. It also weeds out some of the competing organisms, thus contributing to the importance of favorable traits in terms of reproduction. Finally, natural selection hinges on differential reproductive success. We'll get into the specifics of what this means shortly, but for now, know that reproductive success is related to the offspring that an organism begets. More often than not, offspring share the traits with their parents. So if natural selection wants to make favorable traits more common, then what good would it be for the next population if it had the exact same traits as the first, since every organism reproduced just as much? It would defeat the entire purpose of natural selection, and that's why natural selection makes sure that this doesn't happen. Reproductive success. Reproductive success is defined as the number of offspring that survive and reproduce. For example, say that Mrs. Smith has 2 kids. Each kid has 2 kids of their own. What is her reproductive success? 2. Mrs. Smith has 2 offspring that qualify for reproductive success. This is because A, she has 2 offspring, and B, both offspring manage to reproduce. Mr. Clatcher has 3 kids. Kid A has 4 children, Kid B has 1 child, and Kid C has no children. What is Mr. Clatcher's reproductive success? Mr. Clatcher has 2 offspring that meet the qualifications for reproductive success. Remember, reproductive success is dependent on how many offspring can produce their own offspring. So while Mr. Clatcher has 3 kids, only 2 of them successfully reproduced. Since reproductive success only looks at how many direct offspring reproduced and not how many offspring those offspring reproduced, or in other words, it doesn't care about the number of grandkids and only cares about the number of children with children of their own, Mr. Clatcher's reproductive success wouldn't change if he had 20 grandkids or only 2. All that matters is that 2 of his kids had children of their own. Let's try this last example. Mrs. Lewis has 2 children. What is her reproductive success? I'll give you a second to think this through. Okay, so this might have been a bit of a trick question. The truth is that we can't determine Mrs. Lewis's reproductive success from this statement alone. Does she have grandchildren? Did those grandchildren come from one offspring or both? Since we don't have any of this information, we must conclude that we don't know her reproductive success. Now we move on to adaptations. This is a key concept for everything we talked about so far. An adaptation is defined as a change or the process of change by which an organism or species becomes better suited to its environment. In other words, it's a desirable trait or characteristic. These can be morphological, physiological, behavioral, etc. Note that an adaptation, a beneficial trait or characteristic as we define it, always results in reproductive success. You could think of that as the ultimate goal or qualification of an adaptation, reproductive success. Now, in a second, we're going to move on to some specific examples, but first there's something that I should mention really quick. Some students spell adaptation as adaption. Adaption is not a real word, and it could get you points taken off on a test if you spelled it that way, so be really careful that you spell it as adaptation. So here we have an example of a physiological adaptation. In this picture, a skunk is spraying toxic fumes towards a predator, which will then likely lead that predator to leave it alone. I know I would if that predator was me. And I'm sure that you can see how survival can later lead to reproductive success. After all, you can't really produce if you're dead. Here we have a few more examples. Migration is an example of a behavioral adaptation. These animals migrate either for mating or survival reasons, both of which increase reproductive success. On the right, there's a bunch of morphological adaptations that you can go ahead and read through if you want to. So hopefully now you're starting to see what I mean by the word adaptation and how vast of a term it can be. Now, in the last few examples, every adaptation that each animal had made sense. But what about the quote-unquote bad adaptations? Let's look at this example of male cardinals. Male cardinals have evolved to be bright red, which makes them more visible to predators. Yet, this is an adaptation. How can we reconcile these two ideas? Take a moment to see what you can come up with. This is an example of an adaptation because adaptations always increase reproductive success, not individual survival. In male cardinals, their red color helps them to attract a mate. This, in turn, increases their reproductive success. However, females are not bright red because they get to be the choosy sex. They're not trying to get selected or necessarily attract a mate. Instead, their reproductive success is increased by nesting their eggs after they copulate with the mate that they have chosen. Therefore, drab colors are an adaptation for female cardinals. Now we come to our final topic for today, countershading and adventitious adaptation. Countershading is when the dorsal side, back of an organism is dark in color while its ventral side, belly, is light in color. This is most often in marine life. As for why, imagine that you're a bird looking down at the sea. The water's fairly dark, so if an organism wanted to blend in, it would have to look dark to you. Okay, now imagine that you're a fish looking up. The sky above looks pretty bright and it's a lot lighter than the things around you. So if an organism wanted to blend in here, they'd have to be pretty light. Some organisms do both of these things by looking dark to those above them and light to those below them. This is essentially what countershading is. Moving on to the next concept, an adventitious adaptation is defined as the following. In their crypsis, or camouflage, an organism will use the environment around them. This means that an organism will take something from the environment, something like bark, and use it to camouflage itself. These are two common examples for countershading. Notice how on each organism the belly is light while the back is dark. When they're swimming, both organisms will be camouflaged from predators above and below them. These are examples of adventitious adaptations. On the left, the sea creature, maybe a shrimp or something, is using coral from its environment to disguise itself from predators. On the right, a bug appears to be doing the same thing but with sand. Today we covered many topics. For a brief recap, Charles Darwin is a father of the theory of evolution, and his most famous book on the theory, published in 1859, is titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Darwin's theory, evolution, has 5 mechanisms, one of which is natural selection. Natural selection confirms that organisms evolve in a way that benefits them. One of the tenets of natural selection is differential reproductive success. Reproductive success is defined as the number of offspring that survive and reproduce. Something that always increases reproductive success, that is, a beneficial trait or characteristic, is an adaptation. And finally, countershading and adventitious adaptations are 2 unique forms of crypsis, otherwise known as camouflage. Well, that's all that I have for today. So that concludes our 3rd lesson for ecology and evolution. I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.